Thank you for joining. First thing I want to do is make sure that all of our distinguished guests are actually on the panel. Can we sound off, please? Dr. Peter Litchfield, I believe I saw you. There you are, present. Outstanding. Dan Brule, if you're here, unmute yourself. Present and accounted for. There you are, sir. Outstanding. Stig Severinsen, haven't seen your name yet. Are you on the call?
Yep. I am here and unmuted.
There you are, brother. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm going to do introductions in a second. BMAC, Brian Mackenzie. There you are. See your beautiful face. Rob.
I am here.
Rob Wilson. You with us, Rob?
Affirmative.
Outstanding behavior. And Pamela Gold. There you are. Phenomenal. Well, welcome, everybody. This is a very casual, very last minute.
Vi må gerne sidde og snakke, hvis I vil lige så stille med hinanden også.
1 second. We are, in fact, the last minute, we are live with all the joys of live media creation. I'm your host, Sage Rader. I think we're going to call this thing Breathlab. It's going to be a casual series of conversations around topics that affect all of us to maybe bring some clarity around some of the more obscure areas in the breath world and where there may be lots and lots of conflicting information, which tends to be the case with something as ethereal as breath. So that's the intention here, is to come up with a very specific course of conversation that lends itself to a helpful breathing pattern or series of breathing patterns at the end of this conversation that we all know we can begin to engage in, regardless of our starting point, regardless of our needs and our intentions. So let me just go ahead and welcome each of the people by name who's just let us know that they're here. Our distinguished panelists, first is Dan Brule. He is a breath ninja. He's really the grandfather and the grandmaster of all of this in some ways. 45 years he's been studying with some of the world's greatest spiritual leaders, Babaji, Qigong master Hu Bin in China, Osho, and others. He is the leader of the spiritual breathing movement and the author of Just Breathe. He coaches men like Mark Divine, Oren Klaff, and Tony Robbins, and he has taught over 100,000 people worldwide. Stig Severinsen holds a PhD in cellular biology. He is a free diver. He also holds the world's record for the longest breath hold underwater. He's got a really interesting approach, and I'm looking forward to hearing his particular take on some of these topics as it pertains to cellular biology. He's the founder of Breathology and has done an enormous amount of work with folks who have PTSD. In fact, all of our panelists today have done a great deal of work with law enforcement, military, and first responders. And so I want to thank all of you gentlemen in advance. Rob Wilson is also a seasoned veteran of working with law enforcement and military. He is partnered up with Brian Mackenzie on The Art of Breath. I met Rob recently, and I have a great deal of respect for the work that Rob is doing. He's joined us as a part of the Power, Speed, Endurance, Art of Breath, Prepare to Perform duo, and Brian Mackenzie is the other half of that. Brian Mackenzie is a well-known not executive coach, but elite coach, that's the word. If they're elite, military, law enforcement, performers, super endurance athletes, really high performers. Brian's worked with them. He's a best-selling author. He is the founder of Power, Speed, Endurance. He's also, full disclosure, my personal one-on-one mentor, as Dan is my teacher. And so I have a working relationship with him. Pamela Gold is a student of mine and a co-creative partner in what we're hoping will be a platform to bring community and build community in biohacking, which is control of your cellular biology in an internal state that you can bring under your own influence based on a simple knowledge of 8th grade biology and some physics. And she opened Hacked Fitness in New York City, New York's very first biohacking gym. So we have been working together in the breath world for about the last year, and she's extremely familiar with all of this. She also studied cellular biology at Yale. And last but not least, please, I want to welcome the sort of godfather of this conversation, my go-to, Dan Brule's go-to, I think Stig's go-to, everybody's go-to on capnometry. Dr. Peter Litchfield has been working in the field of mindful physiology and pioneering in the science and spirituality of breath work for I believe it's 35 years or so, and he runs the School of Applied Breathing Science. If you are a medical doctor and you want to learn more about breath work, you go to sit under the tutelage of Dr. Peter Litchfield for 2 years, and he will teach you what you want to know. So when it comes to CO2 tolerance and the role of nitric oxide and some of the confusion that was out there in the last several days, I immediately thought to talk to Dr. Litchfield and to bring together a few of my friends that I go to and that I respect on this topic. So I will begin by simply stating that it was put out the other day that based on a 2006 study around the SARS virus, that nasal inhalation is the key to breathing to stop viral replication of the COVID-19 or the COVID-2 virus that gives us the disease, COVID-19. There's an important distinction there. COVID-19 is not the actual virus. And I became dramatically confused because I know that nasal production of nitric oxide is talked about everywhere in the breath world. It's all over social media. Oh, breathe through your nose. It boosts nitric oxide. That's great. However, I sat on a link to one of Dr. Litchfield's calls, a 45-hour program that's a part of his 2-year degree program. And I heard quite specifically that nasal inhale nitric oxide has little to nothing to do with systemic release of nitric oxide. And then I became very confused. That was the origin of this thing. So we'll just start with a very simple question and then we'll go from panelist to panelist. Any of you who wants to jump in and answer or ask a question of the other, please go ahead. Pam and I are going to try and steer this as effectively as possible so that we come out with an outcome. Dr. Peter Litchfield, can you start, please? Just tell us exactly what is nitric oxide? What is its role in human physiology as you understand it? And what is the problem with the assumption that nasal inhale produces nitric oxide at a systemic benefit level? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here, Sage. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to meet all of you at this time, all together, all 100 of us here. That's an unusual kind of circumstance, I think, on Zoom. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. In regards to nitric oxide, there are a lot of myths, you might say, or misinformation that's out there on the subject, for sure. There's a tremendous emphasis on the part of people who do breathing work on nitric oxide produced in the nose. The nitric oxide produced in the nose has local effects. That is, it affects the nose and it also affects the lungs. But that's where it begins and where it ends. If you look at the literature on nitric oxide, you go to PubMed or you go to some other literature listing of what's happening in the area of nitric oxide research, and there's an awful lot of it. All of the literature that you'll see on the subject of nitric oxide produced in the nose is confined to its effects in the nose and its effects in the lungs. That is, one of the things that's pretty clear about nitric oxide is that it plays a role in reducing inflammation in the lungs. And that's an important thing when it comes to looking at the crisis that we're facing with right now, is that we certainly want people to be as healthy as possible when it comes to pulmonary function. And the nitric oxide produced in the nose appears to be important. At least that's what the literature suggests in regards to inflammation issues. However, the nitric oxide produced in the nose, if you go and look at the literature, there's virtually nothing about nitric oxide produced in the nose and its impact on systemic considerations. Nitric oxide is produced throughout the body. It's a body-wide kind of a phenomenon. And the nose really has, as far as the literature goes, virtually nothing to do with nitric oxide on a systemic level. So I just, for example, I just looked at some of the recent articles on nitric oxide in the nose, and there was about 2,400 articles or something there. And all of those articles have to do with the effects of the local effects of nitric oxide. So, and looking at the coronavirus situation, nitric oxide would be important not only from the standpoint of the nitric oxide produced in the nose and the effects on inflammation in the lungs, but also if you overventilate and you become hypocapnic, where you lower CO2 levels body-wide because of, typically what happens is people try to take over the breathing. They try to master the breathing in some way they think is appropriate and good. And what they end up doing is taking control away from the reflex mechanisms that are regulating the breathing. And in so doing, you can essentially inhibit the release of nitric oxide on the part of hemoglobin. Now that's systemic. So if you're hypocapnic, that is, you're suffering with a low CO2 level because you're concerned about breathing, you're taking charge, you're taking it over, the reflex mechanisms aren't working, so that you get a reduction of CO2 in the red blood cell, and you get an increase in pH in the red blood cell, and then the red blood cell, or the hemoglobin in the red blood cell, doesn't release the nitric oxide as readily. That becomes a problem. That is a serious problem, but that isn't related to the nitric oxide produced in the nose. But in any regard, both of these considerations would be important, I think, in looking at healthy lungs. The nitric oxide generated in the nose, as well as the inhibition of the release of nitric oxide by the hemoglobin. So that said, why don't we leave it at that and just open it to whatever questions any of you might have about that.
Great. So real quick, I want to throw to Brian Mackenzie, because Brian and Rob, both of you guys, and then Stig, I want to come to you. Brian and Rob, can you talk to us a little bit about your whole thing with nasal, inhale, exhale, building CO2 tolerance, what it is that you're doing and how it is, because Peter and I talk all the time about how your method steps on your reflexes. When your method gets in the way of your physiology, your method serves your mind, not your actual body. Can you guys talk to us a little bit about what you're doing and how specifically you address this on a daily level and what you're doing with breathwork?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Rob can jump in. Fundamentally, we saw a lot of issues inside the performance world that began with understanding CO2 tolerance. It's exactly what Dr. Litchfield's talking about. We had played around with a number of ideas and saw that from, I guess, the systemic side of things, or adaptations that dovetailed into fitness, right? Meaning they weren't just something that were happening at baseline, everyday life. If somebody engaged in some sort of effort per se, that the overbreathing, the compensation mechanisms occurred, and they happened rather rapidly. And so Rob and I went to work, and we've been testing this for some time on gas exchange, metabolic carts, and finding that even at very, very low levels, let's call it, we used Rob's dog walking extravaganza as one of the big things, because it's something everybody does who has a dog. They go walk their dogs, and ironically, if one is to go walk their dog with their mouth open, and then one goes and walks their dog with their mouth shut, there are two different forms of energy that are occurring. And this would be reminiscent in not how much oxygen is coming into the system necessarily, but how much CO2 is exiting system. And so the fundamental thing that we teach is from nasal, it begins with nasal breathing and understanding that, because the mechanism at play is the control of carbon dioxide, truly, other than the filtering of everything. And, you know, the immune system effects of the mucus, et cetera, sinuses, humidity, all of that. We're taking that out of this conversation right now, since we're focusing on nitric oxide and CO2. And the adaptations that we started to see around controlled variables with nasal development, and then our gearing system, in which we started to understand faster breathing patterns with the nose, et cetera, and moving up into the mouth, where we could actually manage how to keep CO2 levels at an adequate point for better aerobic metabolism. Aerobic efficiency is, I guess, the word we could say. That in turn was, you know, one of the big things we caught on to early on was warm-up times with athletes being almost split in half just due to breath control itself, and or relegating most people just to nasal breathing, and then feeling, oh my God, like that was a workout in and of itself. You know, and that became a sign of where we started to see there's a very different ball game between resting CO2 tolerance. So take somebody like, you know, like Stig, who is a phenomenal freediver, obviously, who has an incredible resting CO2 tolerance. You know, in my work with big wave surfers in the surfing community, we saw a pretty good resting CO2 tolerance. But the moment we started, and I'm not saying this is Stig, but we would take guys who were big wave surfers and being held down by waves, et cetera, and we would start to work them out, and we would start to see instantaneous shifts in CO2 tolerance. So working CO2 tolerance became something very different from resting CO2 tolerance. So meaning the variable had to be changed within both contexts, in which we saw a lot of change occur. So our whole premise to everything we're doing has been around CO2 tolerance, and then stumbling into the work of Dr. Litchfield became quite, I would say, it's almost like finding somebody in a dark cave you've been lost in for quite some time, because literally like years, because we nobody else was talking about this in this way. And then there was this guy who existed who's been talking about it for quite some time on the underground, that has been measuring these things. And we had been doing it not just from gas exchange, but we've been doing it just based off of CO2 tolerance work and understanding how much an individual could handle. And so this became the premise of our program a number of years ago, in really taking a back step or coming back down the mountain, reevaluating how we were approaching not just fitness, but mental health in itself, and then doing work in and around communities that are dealing with trauma. I mean, everybody deals with trauma, and we were getting work from kids to high performers at this point, diseased to high performers, just because of the things that we saw and were able to connect. And now we know a progressive line to take for those things in terms of dealing with one's CO2 tolerance and an ability to use oxygen, which inevitably we see the results, especially from, you know, the work we've been able to do through reading, that nitric oxide from a systemic play is happening based off of what we've understood as a better CO2 tolerance. And not having that is basically not only not allowing nitric oxide production systemically as well, but oxygen utilization as well. So Rob, if you want to step in.
Sure. So, you know, I'll kind of take a step back first and then kind of bring it back around to what I think Sage's original question was, and the point that Dr. Litchfield was making. So, you know, I think first of all, right now, the general public having a sudden concern around, like, what breath practice can I take on to protect me, so, you know, in the acute scenario, from a right now threat, is a little too little, a little too late. It's kind of like, I have to move a 400-pound couch. Can I make my deadlift go up today? And so even if nitric oxide works systemically from nasal breathing, it's a misnomer in the first place, because just starting to do it today is not enough. And I think that the core of the message ultimately to the public has to be, doing these practices increases resilience to all possible incoming threats, because it makes the system stronger from its core. And not necessarily like, if you nasal breathe today, you'll be less likely to get COVID-19. I think there's like a misnomer in the mindset around it just to begin with. And then in addition to that, and to connect that back to purposeful breathing patterns getting in the way of systemic regulators, I would say that even though the physiology is self-regulating, it's not self-optimizing, and that in order to build resilience, of course, we have to initiate some stressor into the system. So a lot of the protocols that Brian and I have developed have been based around purposefully restricting breath frequency during moderated and increasing levels of effort to enhance the robustness of the system, so that lower levels of stressors are less likely to dysregulate homeostasis. That's the basic underpinning. Not that during like normal eupnea, you should be constantly interfering with your breath cycle. Like our bodies are incredibly intelligent, and we have millions of years of evolution to modulate our breath frequency and depth based on our moment-to-moment physiological needs. But in order to enhance the robustness of the system with any predictability, you have to generate some kind of measurable input that you can start to create predictions. So that was what our work was based on, is purposefully restricting breath frequency during increasing levels of stressors in order to enhance robustness. And so I think that is where we can help people focus. I mean, I don't know that's the terminology that we necessarily want to use, but just that CO2 tolerance helps enhance the efficiency of the system, because it's a training stressor, just like any other input that we have. It just depends on the scale that the individual wants to take it to, right?
Thank you, Rob. Stig, please weigh in. Tell us any thoughts you have, add, subtract, divide, multiply. What would you like to say? You got to unmute yourself first, real quick. Sorry.
I will. I thought you were in control. If you could mute yourself though, Sage, because I'm on a quite not so strong connection. So when you have any connection open, it gives like a resonance. I think also for the recording. I guess you're recording this for other people to see. So when you're not on, it's just great that everyone is muted. But now I hope the sound is okay. And thank you for inviting me. In case my phone dies or something happens, I saw a lot of people with chats and questions. I'm not going to answer those, but I'm going to put the thing that we're working on right now, so you have it and everyone has it. I'll put my website, because if this suddenly dies, then at least people have something to work with. So let me put that there. There we go. Give me 1 second. There we go. So, all right, so that should be in the chat. So yes, CO2 and nitrogen oxide and or nitric oxide, different ways of saying it, nitrogen oxide or nitric oxide, depending on if you're in the US or England. I think there's so much incredible work here. Like we got the whole summary from Peter Litchfield and from these other gentlemen, and I think it's a very overlooked topic. And for is the sound okay? Connection is okay? All right, good. I'm just wondering, because I'm a very, very low internet connection here in Spain. I apologize. I got stuck here in the Corona crisis here. So you can hear me okay?
Yep, you're good. You're good, Stig.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll continue. So what I do a lot of course, my background is in freediving. For those of you who don't know what that is, it just means breath hold diving, or skin diving, some people call it. It's holding your breath and either diving deep into the ocean, swimming a long distance, or holding your breath for a long time. That's my, you can say, athletic background. I've held world records in all these disciplines, diving deep, first to 200 feet, first to hold my breath for more than 20 minutes. I saw some lady was asking about that. And I moved it to 21 minutes. Then the last Guinness World Record is 22 minutes. But that's holding your breath, not moving. And then there's also the long distance diving. I have various records in that. The latest, the Guinness World Record I still hold is under ice in Speedo. So that has a different aspect of cold exposure as well, which is interesting in itself. But it's very correct, as we heard before, that when you hold your breath, obviously CO2 cannot escape. So this metabolic production in your mitochondrial energy plant in every single cell, that CO2 has nowhere to go. That has a tremendous effect on pH values. So there's a drop in pH, meaning a raise in acidity, a lowering alkalinity, and that again has a huge effect on the Bohr curve. So the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve for the Bohr effect, speaking in a normal language. Niels Bohr, the Danish physiologist, I'm also Dane, who got the Nobel Prize for this, basically described how oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin molecule, which is those protein molecules in the red blood cells that bind 4 oxygen molecules each. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting myself, but can you hear me, or it's just like Sage is totally frozen in front of me, and I know I'm on a horrible connection. The sound is okay?
You're doing great, Stig. Yep, it's beautiful. Thank you, man. Keep going.
And you can hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for validating that. I don't want to annoy people here and also on the call if they see the replay. Okay, so I'll continue. So in brief, in freediving, we're in a situation where you can say we simulate close death experience, or close to, running out of steam, out of oxygen, which has a lot of benefits, both health-wise and training-wise. And when you have high levels of CO2, you also release oxygen more efficiently, more easily. So that's kind of explaining in words what the Bohr shift is to the right. It's a curve of the oxygen leaving the hemoglobin molecules. The Bohr effect is also related to temperature. Now, we don't have to go too much into that, but briefly speaking, if it's a bit colder, it releases. So, and then there are all these aspects of if breathing affects your pH level, or if we should look more at diet, or both. So alkaline diet, fasting, ketogenesis, all these new things in this kind of new primal living, raw vegan lifestyle, right? Combined with breathing. But I will say this, a great friend of mine who's, I would say, the world's greatest freediver at the moment, William Trubridge, he told me many years ago, I put it in my book, I quoted him, remember, CO2 is your friend. And I think that's a great way of memorizing or understanding that CO2 is very valuable. It has a lot of benefits in your system. And like this other gentleman in the peak performance training was talking about, it has a tremendous effect on your ability to increase your performance levels. So I also train, of course, these big wave surfers. As a matter of fact, we put a whole program together during 60 Minutes. We were filming many years ago. So many of these same gentlemen that do the big wave surfing that are held down and thus need to hold the breath for 2, 3, 4 minutes, not to drown. And when you have a higher CO2 tolerance, then a lot of other things are also affected on a metabolic level, and I would say on a subcellular level. So your whole cell and somatic bioefficiency increases. So without being too, like, it's a very complex mechanism, but we're down on the level of the electron chain transportation. So we're down on a very, very small microscopic level of the cell and energy producing mechanisms in the body. Those are the things you can tap into when you start to level and increase the resistance to CO2. CO2 is the driving force for breathing. So when we feel the urge to breathe, it's because the CO2 receptors in the carotid artery and in the brain, different specific places, they get a chemical stimulus and they're in balance with this gas exchange of CO2 and oxygen in the bloodstream. And the reason people start to breathe or get the urge to breathe is not because they have low oxygen levels. This is the most misunderstood.
Looks like we lost Stig. And then there were 99. Pam?
What he was, this is Peter, I just want to make a comment that it was so important what he was saying is that people think that air hunger is based on, a deficiency in oxygen, an oxygen deficit, and it's not. It's based on increased CO2 levels. That's where it comes from. It's not the oxygen deficit. There are receptor sites that he was going to talk about that are located in the carotid and arteries and the aorta, which are sensitive to pH of the blood, of the plasma, and also the carbon dioxide concentration and the oxygen concentration. But when you get into the brain, the receptor sites in the brainstem are only sensitive to the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid and the CO2 concentration. You see, if someone has insufficient cardiac output, for example, someone's had a heart attack and they have a problem and they feel breathless, and they give them pure oxygen as a result to try to deal with that. That breathlessness does not come from an oxygen deficiency, because when your heart beats and the blood comes through the heart, that blood is fully oxygenated, so that when it gets into the systemic system, the receptor sites detect normal oxygen concentration. So why does the person have air hunger? They have air hunger because carbon dioxide is accumulating in the brain. And any accumulation of carbon dioxide will produce breathlessness immediately as a result. So what you'll find in someone who has a low cardiac output, that they'll start to breathe much faster and more deeply, and they'll start ventilating off a lot of carbon dioxide. They hyperventilate, and they give up that carbon dioxide because they're essentially the blood that then leaves the heart and moves into the system as a whole now has a lower CO2 level, which is going to contribute to reducing that sense of air hunger. The message is that it's all about carbon dioxide is what happens there. And so when you take the pure oxygen, what that's really doing is it's loading up the oxygen in the plasma. The hemoglobin is already normally saturated. So the pure oxygen, rather than having 159 millimeters partial pressure oxygen in the atmosphere out of 760 millimeters, which is about 21%, it's pure oxygen. So the actual oxygen concentration is almost 760, which forces oxygen into the plasma, which saves the day for the patient, because per milliliter of blood, you're carrying a lot more oxygen in the plasma, because the plasma normally only carries about 1.5% of the oxygen. 98.5% or 98% is carried by the hemoglobin. So now you're forcing that oxygen into the plasma so the person has enough oxygen to survive. But that air hunger is based on that carbon dioxide accumulation in the brain. It doesn't have anything to do with the concentration of oxygen.
Peter, I love what you're saying, and the thing that I love about how we're connecting all these dots is because I am always looking at how it integrates, right? Mind, body, and spirit. And when I say spirit, I mean kind of our heart energy. And so what you're saying when we're talking about kind of what's happening physiologically in the body and what's happening in the brain mentally in this hunger, this is kind of the perfect pivot from my perspective to ask Dan Brule to hop in and kind of connect some of these dots, because it is the mind, body, spirit. And I want to try to look at all three of these. And Dan has always been kind of my go-to on the softer side of things. Dan, do you have anything to add in here? I don't know where you went.
Oh, well, yeah, hello, everyone. You know, I'm a big believer in the consciousness factor as it relates to human potential. And obviously our unconscious breathing habits are based on how we train. If I practice certain ways of breathing every day consciously, I'm pretty much training my autopilot, so we can establish either functional or dysfunctional breathing patterns through our daily practice. And for some people that's yogic breath control, for other people that's, you know, Wim Hof stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to begin to practice, but that practice you do every day is kind of, you know, it's programming our autopilot. And so I think it really is important to be in touch with the scientific, you know, the real stuff as we plan how we train. But, you know, if you were to ask somebody if it's possible to do what Stig has done and many others have done, the immediate answer would be no freaking way. And it's that sheer power of the will, it's that sheer power of the human spirit that I think can, in some cases, maybe many cases, or it could be in rare cases, but in some cases, trumps the physiology, trumps the chemistry, trumps the biology. And so, I mean, I'm coming from that school, but I was a deep sea diver in the military. I mixed gases for deep sea diving, and I did underwater rescue. And so I have to honor and respect the real medical stuff. But there's a lot of conflict, and that's one of the reasons that we wanted to have this little conference, is because there's a lot of conflicting information about everything. You know, for every scientific seeming study to prove something, there's a study that proves something otherwise. And it takes a while for the sheer weight of the evidence to accumulate before things shift. And maybe some of us pioneers are putting weight on the scale, and at some point the current scientific biological understanding is going to be forced to shift because of our own human potential growing. So, but I'd like to I have a couple of specific things that I just caught so far I'd like to throw out to Peter and the others. First, to Peter, you started by saying that the local effect of nasal breathing on nitrogen oxide, you know, that there's only a local effect in the nose, you said, and in the lungs. But if the COVID virus literally, you know, gets lodged up deep in the nose, I'm told when they take samples, they stick a thing way up there, and it goes right after the lungs, then that local effect of nasal breathing, shouldn't it help in some way?
Of course. That's what I was saying. I was saying that the local effects are very relevant. For example, you want healthy lungs, and nitric oxide, apparently, if you look at the literature, it's a frightful nightmare of confusion if you go in and you try to read it. But one of the things that is clear is that nitric oxide promotes healthy lung tissue. That is, it is an anti-inflammatory input into the situation. And that's clearly significant. And also, I mean, there's just myriad studies about the role of nitric oxide in nasal function and its role in asthma and that kind of thing. These all being local kinds of considerations. the main point I was making is that one of the main points I was making is that nitric oxide produced in the nose is not a systemic consideration. It's a local consideration, and those local considerations can be very relevant. No one's saying that they're not relevant. They can be very relevant. And there are systemic considerations that are also relevant. And the CO2 level, that is the low CO2 level, what's called hypocapnia, that also, from a systemic point of view, can contribute to inflammation. When you lower the CO2 level, it actually will exacerbate inflammation in various areas of the body, not just in the lungs. So, and one of the things that you were saying earlier that you just brought up, and you're talking about consciousness, you know, from my perspective, you cannot understand the physiology of respiration without understanding the psychology of breathing. They go hand in hand. What people, I think, forget, or they never really thought about it, is that physiology itself is a psychological thing. That life is psychological by its very nature, and that's what makes it life. So if you talk about respiration or breathing only from the perspective of its being some kind of plumbing system, and you don't address, for example, the subject of motivation, which is about consciousness, you can't really understand dysfunctional breathing. Dysfunctional breathing, the psychology of the breath has everything to do with how breathing becomes dysfunctional, or it becomes something useful in doing peak performance training. Anyway, enough said from my end on that.
No, thank you, thank you. Another specific question I had is, well, what exactly, how would you describe the relationship between nitrogen oxide and CO2 levels? So, for example, what we seem to be saying is, if we can bump up our nitrogen oxide levels, that's going to help with inflammation. Same thing with CO2. So, what's the link or the connection between CO2 and NO? Nitrogen oxide and carbon dioxide.
Nitric oxide,
In a practical way, how do we understand that in a practical way so that we can decide how to breathe and what kind of breathing patterns to practice?
Well, nitric oxide, first of all, is produced in the endothelial cells in the vascular system and throughout the body. And when you breathe in a way that you reduce carbon dioxide levels, that has a direct impact on the nitric oxide production in the vascular endothelial cells, in addition to the fact that hemoglobin actually carries nitric oxide there's a particular hemoglobin molecule that forms where the hemoglobin and nitric oxide combine to form a different compound. And when in fact the pH in the cell starts to drop and the CO2 level goes up in the red blood cell, then that particular compound configures differently, and the nitric oxide is released into the bloodstream, so you get vasodilation in that particular area of the body. So if you have busy cells, say somewhere in the brain, and you're doing something and you're using all those cells, and those cells are generating carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide it diffuses into the capillaries, it diffuses into the red blood cell, the CO2 level rises in the red blood cell, the pH drops in the red blood cell as a function of the presence of the carbon dioxide, and then that hemoglobin will release that nitric oxide, and you get vasodilation in that area of the brain, so there's more blood in that area of the brain, which means more glucose, it means more oxygen for that area of the brain. And of course, also, when that happens and the CO2 level goes up and the pH goes down, then the hemoglobin is more likely to release that oxygen, which is the Bohr effect that was just previously mentioned. And so you get more oxygen that's released, and you get more nitric oxide, which means vasodilation. So the presence of the nitric oxide has all kinds of effects. One, I mean, the literature is rich with all kinds of things that you can look at, because as you know, the Nobel Prize was one on nitric oxide back in 1998. A friend of mine wrote a book that came out at the same time, Bob Freed. It was called The Arginine Solution, which was all about nitric oxide. And you know, it's a wonder molecule is what it is. And it has just remarkable effects throughout the body, including in the lungs. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Can I just jump in real quick here, Dan? I just want to say, so if nitric oxide is in essence, from the paper that you sent me, Peter, a type of inflammatory marker, it could be said, right?
Yeah, right.
And this particular virus has something that creates something called a cytokine storm. Can you talk about a hyperactive immune response and the mitigation of nitric oxide and either making that worse or potentially better? It's a question that I've had and haven't been able to get an answer to.
I'm not sure I can answer the question completely, but you would certainly expect, you know, by breathing through the nose rather than through the mouth, that this can only be helpful. Now, you know, it might be just, you know, the coronavirus is such a, you know, it affects people so differently. You know, one person who seems to be so healthy and so able dies. And somebody else who's 80 years old, you know, it doesn't amount to anything and they get through it. Of course, you're more likely to be influenced by it if you're an older person. But nevertheless, the effects are so incredibly variable. It might be that by breathing through the nose and keeping that, you know, raising that availability of nitric oxide or that presence of nitric oxide in the lungs, that may give you some kind of protection to the effects of the virus. I have no idea, but theoretically it might be that people who breathe that way might be, statistically speaking, be less likely to suffer, you know, from the more extreme kinds of outcomes. It might be one of those variables that broke the camel's back, so to speak, that one straw that has this major effect. So if you can keep that right nitric oxide concentration in the lungs, that may keep that final straw off the camel's back that could have an effect on certain people. That's what I, you know, I think that might be a contribution on the part of nasal breathing, for example. And the other thing is the breathing normally from a CO2 perspective. If you can normalize that and that's constant, that may also be another straw on this camel's back that may be significant for certain individuals.
Thank you, Peter. Dan, can we go back to the magical, mystical aspect of breath for a second? I'm with you. I sit on your side of the fence and I venerate science, and yet my own story mirrors one in which science told me I was a dead man. I'm technically the most at-risk human you can possibly conceive of, apart from my 90-year-old grandma, with the amount of pre-existing conditions I have. What can you say about consciousness and the ability to, what Peter's coined, the term is mindful physiology. Brian talks about taking control of our own evolution. How can we breathe and think a better class of chemical into our body, or breathe in a way that makes our consciousness optimal, so that no matter what the physiology is doing, the mind's on top? What do you got?
Well, I think, you know, maybe early life blessings or issues. You know, for example, I remember as a kid, if I had a sick stomach or if I was feeling somehow, you know, like I was coming down with something or uncomfortable or a weird pain, my mother would, with a very light kind of tone, she would just answer me by going, "Oh, that's just growing pains. That's just growing pains." Now, I had other friends who, if they had the slightest little complaint, their mother was at the doctor, they were looking up things, they're worried about them, they're calling the pain, and so maybe there's something about our instant reaction to changes in our feelings. You know, I work a lot with the Systema guys, Vasiliev and a good friend up in Toronto, and Mikhail Ryabko over in Moscow. And they talk about this energetic contraction that occurs, for example, with a blunt force. And so they practice relaxing while they're receiving blunt trauma. and, and they even are affecting whether they bruise or not. So this is getting really cool because, you know, we understand what a bruise is. I have blunt trauma. It breaks these microvessels. Blood leaches out into the tissue, and I have this black and blue mark that might last for weeks until all that stuff is reabsorbed into the system. And what they're teaching and talking about is that you can overcome this immediate energetic contraction that accompanies blunt force trauma, for example. You can preempt the bruising. So, I mean, I don't know where to put this in the scientific world, but it's hard to argue with when it's actually happening somehow. So I'm always looking for, you know, what's the takeaway out of this? And so far, listening to Peter and everyone, I think one thing we should stress is that it seems to be, and anybody correct me if I'm wrong, that if we can increase our tolerance of CO2, that's going to benefit us in immune system function in lots of other ways. Is that a good, accurate general statement? So if somebody wants to practice something, what should I practice? Practice getting comfortable with air hunger. And I think, Peter, one of our very first conversations many years ago, you talked about the pause after the exhale needs to become a comfort zone. I love that. And I've been talking about it ever since, that pause after the exhale needs to be a comfort zone. We have to get comfortable with longer pauses after the exhale. And this was, I loved hearing it because when I met Buteyko back in 1990, that was his main thing. The Russian asthma guy, Buteyko, talked about increasing your comfortable pause after the exhale. And that was one of his main teachings. And so I started practicing that in 1990 because it just gave me evidence of stuff that I had been doing in the military, like intuitively. I mean, I was deliberately practicing holding my breath after I exhaled in case I couldn't take in another breath. You know, it was just my own kind of preparing for a worst case scenario idea. It's one thing to hold my breath when I had a full lung of air. It was another thing to not be able to breathe in after I had breathed out. And so maybe I should get comfortable with that point after the exhale. So I'm just trying to extract something practical that people can take away. Is that an accurate statement to say, hey, if we want to help ourselves, our immune system, ward off things, prevent things, or just help intervene in an illness process, is it a good general rule to say, yes, let's get comfortable with more air hunger. Let's learn to tolerate higher levels of CO2. If we can do that, it's also going to up our nitrogen oxide production, reduce inflammation, all those benefits. Can we get away with a statement like that?
You know, you're talking about consciousness there. And one of the things that is relevant to that is air hunger. And that air hunger is, to a very great degree, a learned phenomenon. It's not just produced by high levels of carbon dioxide. It's like hunger from the standpoint of food. Hunger is regulated through learning. The actual hunger you have when you decide you want to eat. There's a huge literature on blood sugar regulation through learning. I mean, there are thousands of studies. That was an area I was in for a long time. And air hunger is no exception. When you think about it, you know, if you put a blanket over your head or you do something where you feel confined or claustrophobic, people immediately feel air hunger. And that's not a function of carbon dioxide. That's not a function of an oxygen deficiency. It's a function of the psychology of that, the psychology of that situation that's bringing on the air hunger. So it's so important to understand how consciousness is embedded in the physiology, and that's how physiology actually operates. It operates based on the elements of consciousness, that every physiological function there's something that triggers it, and there is an outcome for it, and it regulates itself based on that outcome. There's motivation built into the system, and one of those motivations is air hunger. So in looking at air hunger, it's not just tolerance to CO2, it's learning to feel differently. It's like learning to respond emotionally. Air hunger is kind of an emotion, that you respond emotionally differently in these various situations. Because when you feel air hunger, what are you going to do? You're going to try to breathe more. And if you try to breathe more, what's going to happen to the CO2 level? It's going to drop. And then you're going to be in trouble. Okay, so if you don't address the psychology of it, that is the air hunger itself and what that's about, then you're going to really miss a lot of what's going on in this equation. That's it. That's just an example, because I know that Dan, in talking about consciousness, you know, that's so important in all of this. It's fundamental to everything we do in breathing.
So this was a lot of the work we were starting to see with people, is this air hunger type thing, and connecting parts of what Dan was even talking about this, the Systema guys. You know, we just to kind of there's Dr. Justin Feinstein, who's out of the University of Oklahoma, has been studying CO2 tolerance. He's been studying CO2 and patients with high levels of anxiety, really medicated individuals, and administering bolus hits of carbon dioxide, and one on a single hit. And what he's found is that it has been far more retroactive towards people's understanding of this air hunger and their psychology changing. Because when they get a bolus hit, let's say 65 to 75% of carbon dioxide, not one of us on this call could handle that in any way, shape, or form. The brain is going to go haywire, right? It's going to freak out. But the subsequent breaths after that are not. And so the brain goes, wait a second. This is his theory, is that wait a second, that wasn't so bad. Now I can actually handle larger loads of carbon dioxide, you know, being minuscule in terms of, you know, regular day function. And so we see these diminishing returns of anxiety, right? So anxiousness plummets. And this was a lot of the stuff we were seeing in terms of, hey, we're just administering breath control in whether it's a standalone breath practice and becoming conscious or aware of this. Lo and behold, when we do this during performance, one of the big things that we saw, Dan, and this is going to the Systema guys and starting to blunt force trauma, is weird that if I go out on a multiple hour run or ride or exercise and I'm actually administering breath control to utilize aerobic capacity to its full extent, that the system is no longer, my tissue is no longer getting as stressed and it rebounds faster. I'm not as sore as I would have been prior to that, when I normally would default to mouth breathing, where I'm changing the pH relatively quickly. I'm now stuck in a subsequent habitual pattern that my brain now recognizes as what is easier versus what is happening in terms of actually going on under the hood, right? So everything changes in this essence to how the body systemically is now playing the game. And so our theory has been, and this is, I ripped this off from Dr. Fergus Connolly, but this was in essence in watching our work happen, is psychology just misunderstood physiology? And this goes to Dr. Litchfield's point of the two are not, you cannot, the problem within psychiatry is the fact that we have not connected the fact that this is a physiological problem as well. This is a systems-wide problem that we're not actually addressing. And breath control seems to be one of the counterpoints to getting somebody back to what is the actual problem going on and where does this stem from, quite possibly in childhood, and where breathlessness or this reaction and these habitual patterns fell into place, to where Dr. Justin Feinstein's found out, you know, the panic switch, you don't even need an amygdala for, right? So the fear centers don't even need to be around. But if those CO2 levels get high enough, you sure as shit are going to start to freak out regardless of fear or not, because ingrained in our physiology is the ability to survive and the actual need to breathe. And so those receptors still have play in the game.
Is there room to say something? Well,
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're actually going to go ahead and open it up. Robert Lippman, please introduce yourself briefly and go ahead.
I've been studied with Peter. I've been a Buteyko practitioner for 17 years. Dr. Buteyko's main focus was relaxation. And so when you mention consciousness, my consciousness goes to body consciousness, to the relationship between the movement of breath and the movement of the body. And that relationship teaches me where my tension levels are and where I can soften my tension levels. I just want to put a word in for that, for the biological phenomenon of breath as nutrient in movement, and that it moves our body and brings a sense of our own sense of regulation between tension and not tension when we come into body consciousness. I wanted to add that one piece, and I just wanted to say this other thing that gets overpassed. Close to 9 million people a year die from air pollution. It is a bigger pandemic than the virus currently. We just don't register it that. 78% of those people die from heart attacks and strokes. And so in the people that are talking about being compromised in their lungs, almost everybody on the planet is compromised from air pollution. And we have to take that. So what we're talking about, I think, in terms of how we're taking care of our breathing, is also to maintain our health in relationship to poor air pollution. And the one thing the virus has done right now, of course, is it's cleaned up the air and the water dramatically. So we have, so those 91% have clean air to breathe for the first time in a long time. But for me, the body consciousness is what really brings home how do I manage learning better physiological and psychological and emotional habits based on how I've been holding my tension, which basically encapsulates the breath in a smaller space and makes it harder to breathe, because the tension is holding the breath, not just not breathing, but holding it in a small space. That's my 2 cents for today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was me, Sage, but I'll let Dan. No, I'm just back. I shut down the internet because it wasn't working. So I'm back now, but if Dan has something, I'll wait and then I can come back. But I have a good connection now.
Oh, go ahead, Stig, real quick. Or Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Stig, I'll wait.
All right, we're all being gentlemen here, but okay. So, well, I would just like to zoom out a little bit because, you know, I also have a PhD in medicine and I come from this nerdy world and I love it. But if you say we have 100 people on the call or so, I would love that we also look at the bigger perspective. And I love this last gentleman bringing in the actual facts about the air pollution, basically meaning we might, you know, save lives these days. We're in the corona crisis, but we might be saving the planet and our minds and our sanity and the rivers and everything to millions of people compared to the hundreds of few thousands that will lose their lives, that were compromised to begin with. So that's a very valid point if you want to look at socioeconomical reasons for why we're actually maybe in the golden age right now, besides all the people losing their loved ones. But I would like to zoom out a little bit, if you would allow me, because I think it's great that we're nerding, but if we have 100 people listening and they want to understand it on a more practical level, maybe we should go out and look at some of the things that can be applied right now, because people are afraid and confused. And I agree with every single thing I've heard today on the physiology from Dr. Litchfield, from all you gentlemen. I completely agree in every aspect. But I would like to make it more simplified, if that's okay, if that's the right, to bring in some main points that I have or some considerations.
Please do.
And then again, I don't know, thank you. So I don't know if people are watching or not, but I'll put in the chat, there we go, for everyone, this program we have made for breathing training, breath training in coronavirus. So let's just first, if somebody else is going to look at this now or in 5 years or 10 years, you know, it's probably, hopefully going to be public. you know, there is absolutely no indication that any breathing will help against the coronavirus, meaning that getting, you know, a virus into your body can be circumvented by any kind of breathing. Obviously, nose breathing is better than mouth breathing because it doesn't go, the air in your mouth goes straight into your lungs. In the nose, you have a filter. It has hair, it has microhairs, it has a moist membrane. You produce nitrogen oxide, which is not only anti-inflammatory, it's also antiviral and antifungal. So it has all these benefits immediately using the nose. You also get the right temperature of the air, you get the right flow, so airflow control, the right turbulence of air, laminar flow, turbulent flow, so it has the right speed. It hits the lungs with the right speed, right? This is very important to understand. Then it also connects to the mind, so the psychology. So when you breathe with the nose, this is a big, big thing that Dan is teaching people. It goes more into the psychological aspect, more into the, like the brain has know and understand that you're in a good place, you're relaxing. Going back to that last gentleman who was so correct, it starts with relaxation. In Breathology, that is the platform I'm running, this you know, mission I'm on, and this movement of conscious breathing. It's all about relaxation. The first chapter, as a matter of fact, in my book is all about relaxation. It's not about breathing, because how can you breathe if you're holding on to all this tension, as this gentleman so correctly said? So if you look away from the physiology and the neurophysiology, just at the basic anatomy of breathing, you know, of course, nose breathing is better than mouth breathing. That's just to put it out there to anyone. And it might be, you know, you can avoid some virus or some infection, but we can't say that you can just mitigate, you know, getting, it's like saying you're not getting the flu if you do nose breathing, which would be nonsense, right, scientifically. Then again, we have Corona now, so we don't have the stats, but I would like to zoom out even further, like say we're looking at this cell or the microcell, that level, and let's zoom out, you know, look at all these planets, which is this organ, our body and the cells and the anatomy and the atoms and everything. What can we do? Well, breathing moves everything in our lives. It moves the energy, because we produce energy from the oxygen we take in. Those 21% or 20.9% of the air is oxygen. Oxygen goes into the mitochondria and it turns into energy, the ATP, adenosine triphosphate production, so the batteries of our body, right? Can we improve that? Yes. I also saw a chat message flying by. Can we improve lung function? Absolutely. We can learn to expand our vital capacity. The medical doctors will tell you can't, but if you work with COPD patients, if you work with people with post-polio, Lyme disease, you know that you can increase that lung volume, the vital capacity. You can breathe better, so to speak. You can learn to get the most out of every single breath, which, by the way, happens 25 to 30,000 times a day in every single human, so we can optimize the energy process. We can also start to become stronger in our respiratory capacity, meaning if you do inspiratory training, you train the muscles between the rib cage, they're the inspiratory muscles, then your expiratory muscles. So you have these muscles that open the chest, the rib cage, and contract. If you make those stronger, which is what this other gentleman was doing with the surfers and Navy SEALs and whatnot, then you have a higher breathing capacity, meaning you have stronger lungs, you have more explosiveness. This is great for elite sports, for military. You have more endurance. You also clear the lactic acid faster. You can have that going back to the to produce a glycose, so you get energy again in a different function. When you're running low on oxygen, when you go past your VO2 max, the max amount of oxygen you can take and consume and use for energy production. So we need to look at also how can we strengthen our respiratory capacity. What would that mean on a world population level if we could increase, let's say, all people above 65 or people that are compromised because of bad health, meaning heart issues and cardiovascular problems or challenges. If we could increase those people's breathing skills and levels 5-10%, that would mean hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, maybe not having to go into mechanical ventilation, or what we in Europe call respirators. So that alone would be $1 trillion, saving and saving lives right there. Now, do we know that? No, because there's been no time to do those studies, but we will of course know in the future. So what we can do is strengthen our respiratory capacity, use our lungs better. That's very practical. Get more flexibility in our diaphragm, the breathing muscle that moves the air in and out. And that has nothing to do with NO2 and systemic, which means in the body, compared to local, meaning in the nose. Nitrogen oxide, which also is affected by the food we eat. If we eat beetroot and all those nitrogen-rich fruits and vegetables, that will also help the blood to carry more oxygen and so forth and so forth. But I think it's important that we look, like zoom out a little bit and look at what can people do. And it all starts with relaxation. Over and out. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. You answered a lot of questions for a lot of other people. Dan, why don't you take us home? Rob Wilson's had to go ahead and leave. Sends his best to everyone. Dan, why don't you take us home and then we'll end.
You'll get him.
Yeah, thanks. I'm seeing that, you know, some common takeaways over here. Relaxation, it keeps coming up. I think relaxation is key. Remaining calm when the shit hits the fan, and how, you know, that's so important. And meditative awareness, mindfulness, quiet, clear mind to be able to think our way through these situations. And I'm teaching breath work as a way of, I'm talking about it recently as learning a different way of feeling. I love that Peter brought in that analogy between food hunger and air hunger. And most people, when they're feeling hungry for food, they're not really feeling hunger. It's a different feeling. Some other process is happening. Their stomach is growling, or there's some little abdominal thing happening, and they think, oh, I'm hungry. And it's not a feeling of hunger at all. It's a different kind of feeling, but then they go and eat. So they're misreading their actual physical hunger feelings. And the same thing is true of breathing, that this lack of, you know, this feeling of lack of air, or air hunger, very often it isn't really air hunger at all. It's a different feeling. And so when I'm teaching breathwork, I'm trying to teach people a different way of feeling. And I use that analogy of the, you know, the magic eye photographs, where you look at them and it's just random geometric shapes. But if you focus in front of the picture, you focus behind it, if you change the way you are looking, you see this 3D image pop up. And, you know, people are trying to do it, squinting their eyes, and oh, I can't see it, I can't see it. But if they find that little tweak, and if they look at that picture in the same way that they look at everything else, they won't unlock that 3D image. You actually have to force yourself to look in a different way. And so I relate that to feeling, that through the breath and through the practice of conscious breathing and relaxation and breath work, that we're learning a different way of feeling. And when we learn a different way of feeling, we grow, we learn, we heal, we can start to do things. So I have one last question about the CO2 thing, though, and it's bugged me for a long time since I began my conversations with Peter many years ago. And that is, if CO2 is so important in raising CO2 levels, why not just breathe CO2? Wouldn't that, you know, a common person might ask, well, if raising CO2 levels is so important, why not add CO2 to the air that I'm breathing? Or just breathe 100% CO2 for a couple of minutes? Peter, can you address that? Because yeah, I've had that question in my own mind, and other people have brought it.
The idea is you want to self-regulate. You don't want to self-intervene. Isn't really the goal. It's the self-regulation. And adding something to what Stig was talking about there, he was talking about the importance of relaxation. Well, I would add to that the importance of doing absolutely optimal breathing when you're stressed and when you're anxious. And in all situations, the system wasn't built to go amok simply because you're not relaxed. The system was designed to do the right job in all kinds of emotional states. I think there's a myth out there where people believe, well, if you get anxious, your breathing's going to be bad. And that's just the nature of it. You have to somehow relax to get good breathing. That's simply not true. You can have excellent breathing when you're anxious. Your CO2 level can be right on the money, when you're really stressed and challenged. And it's really important that the breathing be good in those situations. So if you find it necessary to relax to get good breathing, that's a problem. The idea is that there should be good breathing in as much, in as many circumstances as possible. So the challenge, some of the people here have talked about challenge in breathing, and that challenge is so important so that you can maintain that level of breathing. Now, taking that back to Dan, what he was talking about CO2, there was an article quite a few years ago about administering pure oxygen to cardiac patients and how that was problematic. And without going into it, it turned out by adding a little bit of carbon dioxide to the pure oxygen, the stress response that's produced in many people who get pure oxygen disappears. And this was all based on a magnetic resonance study in real time, looking at how CO2 changed brain functioning after administering pure oxygen. So adding oxygen in that situation actually was adding CO2 in that situation was a very beneficial thing. But the idea of adding it, Dan, just because you have a little CO2 snorter with you is really the old paradigm where you're relying on the outside to regulate. The idea is to come from the inside out. So if you're using, carbon dioxide as a way of regulating it, this is just the old paradigm of outside in that we're trying to get away from. It's about inside out. So that would be my comment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love that. Thank you, because that inside out, for me, the deepest core of the inside is consciousness, our essence, our center, our source, is this wild card of consciousness. So thanks for that. Thanks for that little bit. And so there it is. So I don't know, for me, I'm just reviewing my takeaways for myself and maybe to help other people, the takeaways, if we can just kind of summarize what we all have consensus on here, the relaxation, the consciousness effort, and good breathing, yes, but I mean, somebody might say, Hitler was a vegetarian. And what if Hitler had perfect respiratory, settings, and so what, right? That it all comes back to that, right? And that so what is, how are we managing, self-regulating, managing our emotions, managing our mind, managing our behaviors, managing our judgments, managing our fear, managing our anxiety. And so this managing our consciousness, I think, is a real key in all of this. Relaxation is obviously a big takeaway from all of this, and literally breathing exercises. So what are we going to take away from here that could be universally applicable? Is it fair to say that practicing lengthening your pause after the exhale is a good universal practice? Nose breathing, definitely good universal practice. Diaphragmatic breathing, or getting blood down into the lower lobes, air into the lower lobes, where the best diffusion happens. So we do have some unarguable stuff, and maybe that might be a way to close if each of us could just give some unarguable, safe recommendation. I'm thinking of Pat Gerbarg. She's not on the call. I wish she would have been. She's a psychiatrist, clinical psychologist. And she often reminds me, Dan, not everybody can do certain breathing exercises that might be good for a lot of people. If you're, psychologically very fragile, you could snap, aggressive breathing or breath holding could really cause a lot of problems. So coming out of this conference or this call today, are there some things that we can, with 100% certainty, say, okay, this is good for everybody in general? As a rule of thumb to practice, if somebody wants to benefit using their breath to benefit themselves, what can they take away today that's unarguable and safe?
So Stig, go ahead and start. We've actually lost Brian Mackenzie and Rob Wilson. They both had to go, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time on this call. So Stig, if you could just give us a very, very brief, very specific one go-to breathing pattern. I'll do the same. Pam, you can share one that you're using, Dr. Litchfield and Dan, and then we'll wrap the call. Thank you very much. Unmute.
We can't hear you, Stig.
I got you, Stig.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, one go-to breath or practice.
Absolutely. My best weapon I would recommend anyone is 1-2 breathing. It means that you have double the time of an exhale. And what it practically does is that, first of all, you can show this to anyone, your grandma, your child, anxious for schoolwork, your colleague freaking out at work. And obviously nose breathing, inhaling for 4 to 5 seconds, landing softly on the top, and then just with pursed breathing, with your lips, your tongue, your teeth, or your nose, ujjayi breathing, for those of you who know what that is, raising the soft palate. Just exhaling with a little bit of resistance is what I'm saying. What this does is a multitude of things. First of all, it lengthens the breath, so it slows down the breathing cycle per minute, right? You probably cut that in half. Second of all, it triggers the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, which is the relaxed nerve. Let's just call it that. It puts you into rest and digest, into the parasympathetic activation, which restores and rebuilds energy and your immune function, and your mental state. It makes you feel calm and produce the good hormones, not adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormones, but dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin, the feeling good, safe, loved things. And it also makes us, it increases the postural pressure of oxygen in the lungs, because there's a bit of resistance when you breathe out. So it's kind of like this CPAP or PEEP flow. So what you actually do is, if you don't understand what I'm talking about from a physiological level, it's like a balloon. So when you push against something, it opens those balloons. It makes them bigger. So this resistance of your lips or your tongue will open or expand the alveoli, these little flowers in the deep of the lungs. There's about 1 million of them. And around those are all the little fine capillaries, the blood vessels. So when you expand those and make the membrane thinner and breathe with your nose, so you get nitrogen oxide to aid in the vasodilation, so opening the blood vessels, you get more oxygen into your bloodstream. So that's going kind of from Peter Litchfield, from the local to systemic, or at least the first line of through that endothelial cell, the barrier of the blood cells. And then when you come to the end of the exhale, you just turn again slowly. And that also puts a state of calmness in your mind. Because when you're breathing slowly, you're breathing and your brain are moving in synchronicity. So when you're slowing down the breath, you're also slowing down the way that the brain is moving back and forth. So instead of breathing haphazardly without consciousness, being like your brain is in a boxing match, because of the pressure of the liquids, of the blood and the fluids in your body, the brain is moving back and forth. So when you have a more easy, harmonic breathing, you're also calming down the mind. So it gives you both ease of mind and extra energy. And of course, that can be used to restore or recover or even avoid illness. So
Okay.
1-2 breathing is my go-to tool.
Ujjayi 1-2. Outstanding. Thank you, Stig. Dan, what do you got?
You know, what we get out of the breath is what we put into it. Just becoming more conscious, more mindful of our breathing, observing our breath in different moments, just paying more attention to breathing habits, reflexes, and so on. Relaxation, awareness, and positive mindset. Daring to believe that you can do things that you need to do.
Awesome. Pam, what's your go-to breath? What would you recommend if someone needs one tool that they can take away? What do you got?
Really, really similar to what Dan said. It's just being aware of what you're paying attention to, because so often, moment to moment, we lose that awareness and then we get sucked and lost. And if you just keep half of an eye on your breath and keep coming back to it, and make it a moment to moment meditation, moment to moment mindfulness, and then you can choose from your toolbox when you need it. But what I found is if you keep kind of one foot on, one foot off, and you keep that foot on the breath and on the awareness of the breath, moment to moment, paying attention to what you're paying attention to, that's the thing.
Beautiful. Thank you. Dr. Litchfield.
Sure. One thing, a comment I wanted to make on what Stig had to say. One of the things that you can accomplish around what he was talking about really is the desensitization to, fear associated with not getting enough air. What we find is that you have phobia built into the breath in so many people. And by doing the kind of thing he was describing, you can actually accomplish desensitization. It's a kind of behavior therapy, if you will. And so that can be, the actual biological learning of fear that's built into the breath through some previous experience. You can really help people overcome that fear through simply exposing the person to that longer breath out and to that transition time following the breath. But with that in mind, my suggestion is this, that if I had to pick one thing, which really is kind of is really about what I just talked about, and that is where you allow the exhale, you focus on the exhale, and you allow it. There's no pushing, there's no making it longer, there's no nothing. You step away from it, and you observe it, as if your body is your friend, and you want to see how your friend is breathing, and you watch the air go out. You feel, by watching I mean feel, you feel the air go out, and you see how it gets slower and slower, and then it stops, and you feel that moment, that silent moment when it stops, and then a reflex will kick in, and you can feel it. If you focus on it, you can feel that reflex, which gives you a sense of confidence and builds trust in how the breath will take care of itself if you allow it. And at the same time, to notice how minimal the breath becomes, how absolutely minimal the breath is, because you only need a very tiny amount of air to get the oxygen you need, because the system is remarkable. The real limitation in exercise is the heart, not the lungs. It's about how much blood the heart can move through. You can outbreathe your heart by a factor of 20 to 1. For every liter of blood, you can breathe 20 liters of air. And normally you want 1 liter of air to 1 liter of blood. And that's really a safety mechanism when you're doing anaerobic exercise and things that the body does to compensate for that without going into that. But the idea is that you really only need to breathe just a little bit, and it builds that trust in the system where you find that reflex and you see how minimal that breath is necessary. It's effortless. It's effortless. You hardly even notice the breathing if you really focus on it in that way. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Peter. That's brilliant. I'm just going to say very briefly, mine is I got from Dan, and since Brian and Rob aren't here to talk about their tactic and technique and schooling, what I'm doing that Brian has me do is I go take my dog for a walk, I exhale, and I notice how long I can walk. I'm going to walk to that tree. I'm going to walk to that house. I'm going to walk to that car. And if I can get there, that's great. Then I'll extend that. If I can't, I'll notice where I'm at, because it changes every day. And so I'm always looking at that exhale. And for me, it's very uncomfortable, that pause at the bottom. I'm a panic switcher, as Brian says. So I focus on elongating and how long can I have mild aerobic exercise while having a negative or completely exhaled breath. The other thing that I got straight from Dan is it's the exhale, snapping the exhale loose. Peter talked about having a method that steps all over physiology. When your method meets your mind, but it works against your physiology. And you might be a breath master. You might be studying for years this incredible thing that's stepping all over reflexes. What I like about your technique, Dan, is you just release. You snap the exhale loose. You bring it in with some respiratory turbulence, but you focus on letting it out. And I have to do it 1,000 times a day. And when that doesn't work, because occasionally it doesn't, I go to Stig's Ujjayi, very long, very slow back pressure. And that's back to Garbarg and Brown's work, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. If you're listening to this and you don't know anything, just try zipping the lip, breathing through your nose, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, imagining you can breathe from your heart. It's the best I've got. So thank you everyone for being on this call. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stig. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Rob, who aren't here with us, but I really appreciate every single one of you. If you want to leave your email in the chat, that would be great. I think we're going to do this again. Let's try and find another topic and maybe do this again next month. Call it Breathlab, make it a thing, and we'll be out there. Thank you. I really, really, really hope this is useful. We have a lot of love for all of you. Each of you who are on this call is a gift. So thank you very, very much for your time, your attention, and your energy. I honor you. Thank you very, very much. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.